Well, good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us. It is great to see all your faces and that you could join us on this morning for this really important workshop. We've heard from a lot of you that bylaws is something that you really, some of you need to update them. Some of you, I think some of the communities, it'd been years since they've done them. So in some ways, it's really just kind of starting over with the bylaws, but it's definitely something to take a look at each year and sometimes need to refresh them every few years. So this is a really important tool, an important aspect to have for your community because it's really a guiding practice as well that is very beneficial for you to refer to. So I'm thankful that you all can be with us. And I'm Terry Wells with WNC Communities. For those of you that haven't, you get lots of emails from me, but some of you I know maybe haven't seen my face or haven't had the chance to meet in person yet. And I'm really excited because we are going to have Becky Bowen with us today from NC State Extension. And I'm so thankful for Ross. I think it was Ross somehow that first put me in touch with Becky, and I found out about Becky and this wonderful resource because she is going to give us some really useful knowledge today because she has a lot of experience in this area. And I'm hopeful that she'll continue to work with us going forward. And she has I'm going to let her tell you some about what she's been doing in our Western North Carolina region. And then she may have actually worked with some of you in the past. So we're thankful to have her. And I do want to just also mention a couple of other folks that are on here with us and are helping out today. So Ross Young is director of the NC State Extension in Madison County and works with your community centers in Madison County. So thank you, Ross. And Steve Duckett is our Buncombe County, North Carolina Extension Director and works with the community centers in Buncombe County. So I really appreciate the two of them being with us today as well, because they're great resources within their counties and have a lot of knowledge. So they're really good to go to as well. So thank you both for being here with us. And at this point, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Becky to introduce herself and get us going today.
Hey everyone, I'm Becky Bowen, and as Terry so graciously said, I'm with NC State Extension. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the screen now because I have a spot where I tell you a little bit about myself. So we'll just do it in conjunction with the slideshow here. So let me know when you can see this.
Yes. Now, Becky, let me ask just for guidance for them. Do you have a recommendation of what view they have on, like the side-by-side speaker, or side-by-side gallery? Does it really matter?
It's really up to you what you think is best, Terry.
Okay.
So if you want to just make that recommendation, I'll go ahead and enter. Oh, you admitted star. Okay, yeah. Great.
The main thing is you all definitely need to be able to see what she's sharing. I think you all can. And then you've got some options up there in your view. There's side-by-side gallery, which that way you might see a few of us, or you can just do side-by-side speaker and you're always going to see what Becky's sharing and you'd see whoever's speaking at the time, which will mostly be Becky. So you have a couple options there.
I will be asking for feedback in some sections. So.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. And we are going to spend the next 2 hours together talking about how to write great bylaws. So as I said, my name is Becky Bowen. I am an attorney. When I do have a license in North Carolina, but I can't really say that I'm actively practicing at this point. But when I did actively practice law, I primarily focused on commercial real estate and finance when I was with a law firm in Texas. But after I left Texas, I moved to North Dakota, where I was doing community economic development work with several smaller communities. And it was at that point in time that I became more familiar with nonprofit law and community economic development. Right now, I'm at NC State Extension. I've been there since 2013. I do not live in Raleigh. I live in Winston-Salem. And I am the program manager of a program called Cultivate NC, which is all about community economic development. And in the first 8 years of my work with Extension, I did some work in the western part of the state, but it was mostly in the Piedmont and the southeastern region of the state. But recently, I am doing a whole heck of a lot of work in Western North Carolina. Actually, I am working with Jackson, Swain, Macon, Graham, and Graham counties and the Koala boundary doing some regional economic development planning. Okay, so I mentioned that I do or have done community economic development work and worked with a lot of nonprofits in North Dakota, but actually the way that I got started in nonprofit work was I was the executive director of a semi-professional ballet company in Bismarck, North Dakota, of all places. And what you see here is a picture from Nutcracker, that's of the little girl Clara, and the soldiers are surrounding her there. It was a real trial by fire running that nonprofit. Imagine trying to sustain a $300,000 budget each year, pay dancers, pay other staff in a part of the country that isn't known for being particularly culturally savvy. But I am proud to say that that nonprofit has survived. I did leave in 2007, I think. I started it in 1999. So you want your nonprofit story to be one of sustainability and continuation. And so what I'd like to hear from each of you is just a little bit of background. I'm going to stop share right now. If you could tell me a little bit about what your nonprofit story is. I'm going to go through the screen here and just call on each of you, if you don't mind, just briefly sharing what your nonprofit story is, what your experience in nonprofits is. So Nina, I'm going to start with you. All right, maybe Nina stepped away. Nancy, how about you?
I work with Great Creek Community Development. I work with Great Creek Community Development Club, and we have a lot of projects. We have the Great Creek Homemakers under our umbrella, and we just do a lot of community activities. I also work with Unaka Community Development Club, and they are a great club. They're very active, and we have a lot of members there. So those are the two community development clubs. I also work with retired teachers and all of that. But anyway, that has
Great, thank you, Nancy. Chris.
a whole lot to do with the nonprofits.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm with the Revere Roscoe Community Center. We have been a community center since 1990. We became incorporated in 1991. So we've been around for a little while. Ready for some updates.
Great, thank you, Chris. Ted.
All right, I'm unmuted. Our Bethel Rural Community Organization in Haywood County really is not looking for development. As opposed to that, we're trying to maintain our rural nature. About 12, 15 years ago, we paid Mars Hill to conduct a study of the community, and 86% of the community said that they wanted to remain rural. So our focus is on two things: preserving the history of Bethel and maintaining the rural nature. of that. And in conjunction with that, we've produced DVDs and books because we think to maintain what we have, we need to educate the folks. So the DVDs and books are an education. We have worked feverishly to, there are 3 steps in conservation. There's a let's see, voluntary ag district and conservations. Doing a voluntary ag district is simply talking to the farmers and get them to understand why it's so important to remain rural and get their agreement. And we've done that for maybe 500 or 600 acres in Bethel. And then the most aggressive step is a conservation easement. And that's where the property owner commits to no development. And I think we've gotten maybe 200 acres in that way. So in addition to those 2 major thrusts, we have a food pantry monthly. We support the schools and the fire departments in our district.
Great. Thank you, Ted. Ruth.
Self unmuted there. We've been a community center since I think it was 1980, but 501c3, maybe 6 or 8 years. It was an agricultural area, but our area is becoming more and more of to some degree, a bedroom community for Asheville. So we're just trying to provide activities and events and things so that people don't have to go into Asheville to have a park or to, get together with friends and various things.
Great. Thank you, Ruth. Evelyn.
Yes, I'm with Ted, pretty well covered everything. I'm also with Bethel Rural Community Organization. I'm head of the Historic Preservation Committee. We have produced 3 DVDs, 2 CDs. We've collected 25 or 6 art prints now. We've received state history awards for all of those. And I would recommend to any community, your history is important and start collecting it. And that's what our focus has been. And Ted pretty well covered the rural preservation. We started from another group, Bethel Community Organization, back in 1990, around 2001. We became Bethel Rural Community Organization because there was a movement to extend water and sewer into our area, which sounds great, except without zoning, there's a lot of massive development that would have occurred. So we didn't want that. As Ted said, we wanted to remain rural. So that the Pigeon Valley Citizens for Rural Preservation's kind of combined with Bethel Community Organization, we decided to become Bethel Rural Community Organization. And at that, and I think we got our 501c3 around 2008.
Great. Thank you, Evelyn. Norma. Oh, Norma, you're muted.
I am from the Shallow Community Association, and we're an organization that was started in 2000, and it was started because of the encroachment of commercial business into our neighborhood. Our organization became a 501c3 in 2005. We are geared to helping our community with infrastructure, and also we have a community garden where we give free food to our residents. We also have events at our community garden, which has an amphitheater and a pizza oven. We have a lot of artwork at our garden. We have a legacy art trail, and tours are given for people that would like to come and see our garden. And we continue to have programs to educate our youth in financial literacy and other things that happen in the garden, like cooking and harvesting food and planting.
Thank you, Norma. Paul.
Hi, I became the chair of the Greater Ivy Citizens Community Center about a month ago. And but I've been a board member for about 5 years, and the place I find myself in at this time is a transition point within this association. It has been for the past 20 years ago, the association was started, and the work of the GEICA board and membership has been more of a maintenance kind of thing in terms of the building and the grounds. Recently, the county is picking up that maintenance responsibility. And also recently, there has been a major restoration of a creek that runs nearby our property, and or I should say the county's property. And so what we're aiming at doing now is community education, recreation, walking trails, kind of a nature orientation at this point. And I'm jotting down ideas from other people who have spoken so far that may be other directions we can take eventually too. But that's basically the focus for the time being.
Thank you, Paul. Judy.
So I'm Judy Futch. The only thing I will add is that the community center is actually the site of the original Beach Glen School, which was unfortunately, because it was in really bad shape, it had to be torn down, and the association actually rebuilt this state-of-the-art community center. It's a great source of lots of softball games, and before COVID, it was actually a place where Meals on Wheels was served. Elderly could come in. They had a quilting program. Obviously, all that has changed. The bylaws, from what I can figure out from the original bylaws, are written in 1977, and they were updated in 2004. So that's one of the reasons of what we're trying to do is just make sure that the membership and how the organization functions is actually how it needs to function.
Great. Thank you, Judy. Barbara.
Okay, so I'm with the Upper Laurel Community Center in Madison County. I'm a new member, so what I know is the group has a 10-year lease on the Ebbs Chapel School in Upper Laurel. And the school is one of those lovely old stone schools that the county was going to tear down at one point. And a lot of people thought, whoa, don't do that. This is a wonderful resource. So that's what the intention is of the Upper Laurel Community Organization. We want to make the school to be a community place, and we're renovating it one room at a time. We have an auditorium where we partner with the Madison County Arts Council to provide a venue for music and art performances. We are going to start a quilting group to come. We have a medical clinic in the school, and we had an exercise program until COVID shut us down. So we hope to start that up again. So my goal is to make us a little bit more organized, and certainly bylaws will be a good start for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Karen.
I'm Karen Hammett, and I'm with the Fines Creek Community Association in the northern end of Haywood County. We are housed in the old Fines Creek School, which was at one time K-12. We have 4 large buildings on our campus. As has been previously mentioned, they wanted to tear these buildings down once the buildings were emptied after consolidation. And those who went to school here said no, which is probably a good thing because you can't rebuild. We're in a floodplain for the Fines Creek. So we've got these buildings, which takes quite a bit of effort just to maintain, but we also have wonderful space to do programs for the community. We have an old gym, we have a cafeteria, we have a number of classrooms. And with our lease from Haywood County, we are now also able to sublease for entrepreneurs who want to start their own business in some of these large classrooms. That certainly slowed as a result of COVID, as many things have, but I expect that will probably resume as things improve. One of the things we do is a food pantry through Manna Food Bank because we are at least 30 minutes from the nearest grocery store in our area. And for many of those who live further away from the school, it's longer than that.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Gina.
Hi, I'm Gina from the Big Ivy Community Center in Barnardsville. That community center, it's located on the banks of the Big Ivy River. It's been a place where people have gathered for as long as we know about, from a Native American fishing camp to a CCC camp in the 30s. In the 80s, had a full service daycare, medical clinic, community center. Now we have a pool, walking trail, pretty robust program. I came on board in May. My background is decidedly for-profit recreation and community building. Worked 18 years in Yancey County at Mountain Air and at Biltmore State, but the board decided to take a risk and bring me on to help coordinate the program now. So we are feeling the momentum of waking back up after that COVID sleep.
Great. Thank you, Gina. James. You're muted, James.
There we go. My name is Jim Thorson. I think it was Schultz was the character on Hogan's Heroes back in the day when he used to end the line with "I know nothing," and I'm a
Schultz, yep.
Colonel Schultz. Anyways, I'm a new member to the board of the Greater Ivy Community Center in Beach Glen. The Beach Glen community, which is about 3 or 4 miles to the east of Mars Hill in Madison County. Paul and Judy are I'm just going to basically stop talking. I've only been a board member for a month, and Paul and Judy pretty much gave a good recap of our community center.
Great, thank you, Jim.
Sure.
Lorraine.
Hey. Hi, good morning. Thank you very much. I'm going to jump on the back there and say that I'm also a fairly new member of the Spring Creek Community Center. I don't see anybody from Spring Creek on here so far this morning. But one of the things I'm passionate about, is that we have a Forever Fitness program that I'm happy to say I'm part of, and we kept it going all through COVID. There wasn't one single month that we didn't have a class, and it was outside. And we chased the sunshine. Wherever the sunshine was, we got our bums out there. We have a lot of isolated people here in Spring Creek. And that was our goal. Get out and move, but also socially connect as well. And we, thank God, kept that going. Also, we have a nutrition center. We have a great gym. An absolutely great gym that we use, when we can. But there's more to the story. There's phase 3, which Alice McVeigh is currently trying to raise funds, has been doing some great grant work. And it's, as everybody knows, it's try and get your foot in the door and see if you can possibly be considered for grant money. Not easy, apparently. I wouldn't touch that one, but a 10-foot pole. I'm great for the regular fundraisers. I love it. But there's also the other side of the story, and that's the bylaws. And we've got some confusion. They were recently updated. very, very, very loose, in my opinion, and very loose in a lot of people's opinion. So I think, you know, any guidance we can get about how other people do it. I too have been taking some notes about how people do stuff. I loved the idea of the community garden. That is wonderful. And the history, if you walk down the halls of Spring Creek Community Centre, you're going to see photographs. And unfortunately, due to people passing on, we actually end up inheriting some photographs. But the halls reflect the history, which is so important. It's a lovely old community building. Obviously, you can hear by my accent, I'm not American. Well, I am now, but I'm Irish. I come from a country full of old buildings, but you don't see them here very often. And these old community centres, very well worth preserving. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lorraine. Star. You're muted.
Hello?
Star, can you find if you scroll to the bottom of your screen, there should be an icon of a microphone, and that should unmute you. Oh, well, we're going to move on. Georgia?
I'm from the Shallow Community Association, and this is with our 21st anniversary this month.
Congratulations.
And Norma has told you just about everything that you need, that we need to know. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Georgia. Babette.
Yes, hi, I'm from Shiloh Community Association also. As you may know or may not know, that we are rich in our history, that we are right across from Biltmore Forest. We have, our community is one that is all residents, and we have strived very hard to keep it that and to keep our commercial out. We've done very good with doing that. We also are very diverse. We have different cultures. We service the seniors. We have the youth. We also have projects inside of Shiloh where we have training for young people. Our goal is to be able to have our own resource center that we could actually do a lot more things for our community. But I would invite everybody to just, if you want to go online and you'll see Shiloh Community Association, you will see the history of Shiloh because it is very rich. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Babette. All right, we've got three more. Maria.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm with Spring Mountain Community Center as Ruth. We work together on the board. We've had the community evolving, as she said. We've gone from a rural farm community to more of a bedroom community. We are striving to serve the changing population in ways that they would like for us to offer activities and facilities for them. So we're really trying to look at a new function in our community.
Great, thank you, Maria. Star, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Good morning. Full moon technology problem, sorry. I'm with Revere Rice Cove Community Center. We have been in existence, as Chris said, since 1990. I was the first president. And so it's been a long history of nonprofit for us. And right now we just had a new board change. And we are currently working very hard to get a senior nutrition center. We have it established, and now we have created two positions, paying positions for people in our community. Our bylaws are old and do need to be updated, and that is one of the main focuses for this, to be here. But we have been participating in just about anything that has food going on. We've been participating with the USDA boxes. We've even done chicken with House of Rayford. You know, and of course, there is a local Mars Hill church that has been doing Lord's Harvest boxes, and we're participating in that as well. We've just been doing a little bit of everything. And of course, one of our big things, our building we built from the ground up. We used to meet in a store building with a light bulb hanging from the ceiling. So we've come a long way in that respect. But we are trying really hard to get this meal site going, and that's our main focus right now.
Thank you, Star. Alma. Oh, you're muted. Oh, you're still muted. There you go.
Hello, my name is Alma Atkins, and I represent two of the Shiloh community active programs. One is the Shiloh Community Association, and then Project Lighten Up, programs of excellence. In looking at bylaws and how that works, and also with getting grant funds and things like that, I was very interested in this program by learning about the functioning of nonprofits and how they function on the guidance of bylaws. Reviewing the bylaws, we at an association are in the midst of wanting to review our bylaws for updates. We're also looking at that with the Project Lighten Up and making sure that the programs under those 501, that 501(c)(3), both with Shiloh and with Project Lighten Up, are guided by bylaws, because there is a lot of growth and development and collaboration with other organizations to do the work that we do in the community. And we just really want to make sure that the bylaws represent what we say we're going to do, that they are derived from a strong mission statement and vision, and just, you know, to really sharpen up on our tools so that as we do move into the future and others come behind us, that they have a really good path so that they can continue to build on the wonderful work that both organizations have already begun and are doing.
Great. Thank you, Alma. All right, Martha, you're the last one.
She may not, I'm not sure if she's able
Okay.
to unmute there.
All right, that's fine. Well, thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed hearing your nonprofit story, and it sounds like we've got some people who've been involved for years and years and years with the organization, and then we've got some new people who are coming on, and then there's just general interest in whether or not your bylaws are doing the job that they're intended to do. So I am going now to go back to the presentation. Okay. So we're about to go into some legal stuff, and I have to admit, as an attorney, I am very familiar with the fact that talking about legal stuff can be really dry and boring. So I'm going to try to make it as interesting as possible, but I also have to do that legal thing where I disclaim that everything that you're seeing in these slides are for educational purposes only. This is not legal advice to you, and I recommend that after you attend this session and you learn about, maybe you've got some holes in your bylaws, that you not just copy the samples that are in the presentation, but you actually make an appointment with an attorney to review your bylaws and just make sure that they're up to snuff. Okay? All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to define the nonprofit structure. Many of you who have been nonprofit leaders for years and years are very familiar with this, but I just want to, for maybe one of you newer ones, for you to understand what it means to be a nonprofit. Then we're going to go into sort of the standard provisions in the bylaws and make sure that you are up to date with respect to those. And we're going to talk a little bit about some specific bylaws provisions. Now, the bottom bullet there talks about a class exercise of refreshing your bylaws. What I've done instead is I have breaks within the presentation where I'm going to ask you some questions. If you have your bylaws with you, you can quickly rifle through them, see if there's something there. If there's not, then make a note that maybe you should include a provision to this effect in your bylaws. And if you don't have your bylaws, Terry has said that this presentation is being recorded, so you can, on your own time, skip ahead a half an hour and start getting into the presentation and review your bylaws that way. Okay, so nonprofits may or may not be independent legal entities. And what I mean by an independent legal entity is that your organization is considered under the law to have a separate existence from the persons or businesses who are involved with it. So a separate legal entity can be sued or sue. It can own property, it can borrow money, it can enter into contracts. And in the case of for-profit entities, it will also pay income taxes. Unincorporated associations can also be considered not-for-profit, but they're not independent legal entities, and they will not be considered tax exempt at the state or federal level unless and until they file the necessary paperwork with the Secretary of State for state level exemption and with the IRS for federal income tax exemption. So in order to become tax exempt, you have to be incorporated. So gaining that tax exempt status, some of you are 501c3s, some of you aren't. That's a topic for another session. I'm not going to get into that, but I do want to mention a little bit of information about how you treat revenue. So keep in mind that all money coming into an organization, whether it's from event receipts, ticket sales, product sales, grants, donations, is considered revenue. Revenue from product sales is generally not tax exempt, and only a very limited number and type of nonprofits are exempt from sales and use taxes. So be sure to ask for a letter of clarification from the Department of Revenue on how, if you are doing ticket sales or event sales or product sales, you might want to get a letter of clarification with respect to your activities to make sure that they are not tax exempt. That's all I'm going to say about the tax stuff, but I do have a handy dandy resource listed at the end. It is a place that nonprofits can get in trouble. So if you are currently unincorporated, but you do decide to incorporate, what you gain is the sense of an independent legal status. In other words, the business is separate from the individuals, the officers, the directors, the members. It's independent from them, has its own identity. You also gain what's called limited personal liability. What you lose if you incorporate is the sort of unregulated freedom. So if you become a corporation, you're going to have to report to the state. If you're a 501c3, you're definitely going to have to report to the federal government. You'll also lose time and expense because it costs money to comply with all of these regulations, right? Time and money. Now, just a few words about about limited personal liability. What this means is that board members, officers, staff, and members, if you have, will not be personally responsible for any damages caused by the organization or its debts. But limited is not absolute, right? Limited liability does not mean absolute protection for those board members, officers, staff, members. That's why most organizations will have D&O insurance, directors and officers insurance. But even D&O insurance won't protect you if you, as a board member or an officer, engage in bad faith or allow the organization to operate outside of its intended purpose. And this is where it gets important to take a look at what your bylaws say. So it's also very important that board members and staff understand their roles and responsibilities. And it's good to have those roles and responsibilities outlined in your bylaws. Any questions so far about limited personal liability or independent legal status?
So Becky, we did have a question about what D&O stands for, and I think you did. You want to just go over that a little bit more?
Right. D&O insurance is directors and officers insurance. So you should talk to the nonprofit's insurance agent about acquiring that, and that will protect your directors and officers. If you're really small and you're not really engaging in anything that, if you're not incurring any debt, if you're not involved in anything that might cause any sort of issue or damages to anyone, then it's not as much of a concern. But if you do have a building, that's an asset. People might get hurt in the building, so that's where you want to consider getting the D&O insurance. Okay. So corporations bear responsibility for the debts of the organization. They have clear statutory rules for governance. They set their own internal rules for governance. So not everybody's bylaws are going to be the same. You have a lot of flexibility and independence on what you want to put in your bylaws, so long as it does not conflict with state law. And I'll give you the chapter and verse. I'll give you the citation for what the North Carolina statute is for nonprofits. Corporations, of course, are formed by filing articles of incorporation with the North Carolina Secretary of State. I think most of you have already done that. So I like to use this metaphor. So the primary formation documents for a North Carolina nonprofit are the articles of incorporation filed with the Secretary of State and the bylaws. Those are the two primary formation documents. It's also necessary to file a charitable solicitation license if you are planning to ask for money. So I like to analogize the two primary documents, which are the articles and the bylaws, with the two foundational documents of our nation. So the articles of incorporation of a nonprofit
Becky, we can't hear you.
Represent for a new nonprofit corporation. It is the declaration. Sorry, I just got a notice that my internet was unstable. Is everything okay? All right.
We're not hearing you consistently.
Should I switch to audio, a different audio?
You might want to try that.
Okay.
You're cutting in and out.
Okay. All right, everybody, just take a break.
The irony, we thought in Winston-Salem that Becky would have the strong internet.
So Becky, we didn't lose you until you started in on articles of incorporation, but if you could just repeat once you get started, the articles conversation, that would be great.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Right.
can you turn up the volume a little bit, or maybe everybody can adjust their volume if they need to?
All right, can you hear me now?
That's good.
Okay, great. All right, so I'll start over on this slide. Sorry about that. So the Articles of Incorporation are like the Declaration of Independence. So it's like, hear ye, we hereby exist. We're no longer an English colony, we're our own separate country. We stand independent and alone. So that is what the Articles of Incorporation represent for a new nonprofit. It is the declaration of the incorporators that they have formed a new separate standalone entity. So when you do your articles, there's a form that you can get from the Secretary of State where you fill in a few boxes, or you can have a lawyer draw it up for you. I recommend that you have a lawyer draw it up for you, because it is important that you include certain special provisions in those articles that are not in the form if you plan to file for 501c3 status. Okay, and we'll get into that. So that second foundational document is the bylaws. And when you hear the phrase, that's unconstitutional, the speaker is referring to this document, which is the US Constitution. Did you know that each state also has its own constitution? And every company, including nonprofits, has a document that represents its constitution. In the case of a corporation, that's the bylaws. Most people haven't read the US Constitution, and consequently, they don't realize that the Constitution is more than just the Bill of Rights. When we hear the term, that's unconstitutional, we think that there's an infringement of our First Amendment rights, like freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, Second Amendment, right to bear arms. All of those are in the Bill of Rights, which are actually amendments to the Constitution. What the Constitution is, actually, is the internal governance document of this country. Article 1 sets forth the powers of the Congress. Article 2 sets forth the powers of the executive branch. And Article 3 sets forth the powers of the judiciary. So, like the Constitution, the bylaws are going to say what are the powers of the organization, who are the people who are in charge of running the organization, and what are their limitations, right? So the Constitution is the internal governance structure of our country, much like bylaws are the governance structure of a corporation. Any question about that?
I think
All
we're
right.
good.
Good. So what are bylaws? The function of the bylaws is to reflect the goals of the organization. They're contained in a single formal written document that answers the questions of who, what, where, when, why, and how of an organization. And these questions define the boundaries of the organization. Without defining those boundaries, an organization can operate far beyond its original intent. So have you ever heard of the term mission drift, right? Where you're kind of operating outside of what the original intent of your organization is. The organization can expand a little bit outside of its scope, but we want to give an arena in which to operate. So that's why it's important that when you have that what you have in your bylaws includes a purpose statement, and that purpose statement should also perhaps include your mission and vision statement. Okay? If
you start operating outside of the confines of your bylaws, including your mission, purpose, there's a possibility that your organization could be challenged in a court, because it's violated its own bylaws. And if your organization has violated its own bylaws, there's the possibility that the organization's structure, corporate structure, can then be pierced, and the individuals that represent that organization, the members, the officers, the board of directors, all of a sudden are no longer protected by that corporate shield and become personally liable for the actions of the organization. So that's why it's really important that you operate within those confines of your bylaw. So why have bylaws? It reduces chaos. It is the source document that you run to in order to determine how to answer questions. It is required for formal incorporation and for tax exempt status, and it provides those guideposts against mission drift. All right. So now we're going to get into the standard provisions in bylaws. So the first one, pretty easy, name and purpose of the organization. So stating the name of your organization should be pretty easy, but it's also helpful if you're known by something else, like if you're known as, in this case, the community center, then go ahead and call yourself the community center. So put both your formal name as you are registered with the Secretary of State, but also include what else you might be called. You know, if there's, you know, some sort of acronym, include that, right? So everyone understands that this is who you are, okay? And then that second piece about purpose. If you are a 501c3, you're going to need to have the special language in there that refers to being exempt under the 501c3. But you also want to put what your purpose is. And this is where you might want to also include your mission and vision statement. Okay? So clearly defining your group's purpose helps you to focus your organization and all of the board members and staff and anyone associated with it. Make sure that they have a copy of your bylaws and point them to that purpose or mission statement. It's also helpful, you know, if you have a geographic region that you represent or serve, then it's also nice to put that sort of those geographic boundaries or specific population. That's also important too. Okay, the second common standard provision are the paragraphs that deal with members. Now, not every nonprofit has members. And that is a specific election that you make when you file your articles of incorporation. So if you do have members, and we're going to spend a few minutes talking about membership, if you do have members, it's important for you to state what the members' rights are, who the members are, so who can be eligible, what their limitations are, and what the requirements for membership is. So in this example here that was provided to me by Terry, so the membership of the community center shall include all residents, landowners, and other interested persons 18 years of age or older who've shown an interest in the community center by attendance at meetings or other community center activities and who have annually attended at least 2 community members or community meetings. So you can see that they've opened it to everyone who lives in the area, who has an interest in the community center. However, they've also limited it to, it's just not everyone, it's those who've clearly shown an interest by attending at least 2 community meetings. All right, so you want to make sure that, you know, if it's important to you, that you define your membership, and it's important to you that you give voice to those people who've really been interested in your organization. Putting this type of limitation on it is perfectly fine, right? And it helps them define who their members are. So the question is, do you have members or don't you have them? And why should you or shouldn't you? So in North Carolina, being member-based or not is an option that you must select in the articles. And whether you have members is fundamentally a question of how your board of directors is going to be elected. So the benefits of having members is they can have a lot of different skill sets, qualifications. They can represent different interests. In other words, they bring diversity to the organization. They bring different talents and gifts to the organization. And then if you have members that aren't all the same, but have this diversity to them, you can therefore ensure that your board represents all of your organization's constituents. Another benefit of having members is a way for the founder to control the organization. So the membership definition can be written to actually sort of satisfy the founder. This is not something that I would recommend, but this is something that the benefits of being a member and having that membership definitely restrictive can be beneficial to the founder of the organization. The disadvantages of having a member-based organization is you have member meetings and you have board of director meetings. If you don't have a member-based nonprofit, you're just going to have the board of director meetings. But if you do have members, then you're going to have member meetings and board of director meetings. You're going to have 2 sets of meeting minutes. You're going to have 2 sets of meetings. And you also have members, your members will have rights to certain information. They're able to sue in the name of the corporation, and they have the right to approve or disapprove certain fundamental transactions, like amending the bylaws or dissolving the organization or choosing to merge with another organization or purchasing large assets for the organization. So any questions about this slide?
So yes, Becky, I have a question because this brings up a real interesting point. I would hazard a bet that most of our community centers were originally set in their bylaws of having members based on kind of those documents that I've seen. And I don't think that they're doing 2 sets of minutes and meetings and all of that. If I'm recalling correctly from just looking at a lot of those historical documents and seeing some updated, I think like the member, and maybe Ross and Steve can end up speaking to this some too. I think the members were because they were the ones who would also be allowed to like vote on, right, who's going to become board members, or they would have a say also and be able to vote at some of the meetings. And so that I think is how like the membership had historically been done. I don't think that, so it'd be interesting if you're saying that they're required to do 2 separate meetings and minutes, because that is not typically how it's been done. And that was not a requirement that I was aware of. So is that a specific legal requirement?
So are you saying that all of the meetings, the members are invited to all of the meetings of the board?
So I would say that it's done differently at some of the community centers. I know that at some, yes, basically they're community meetings.
Right, and If they're joint meetings, if they're all joint meetings, then the minutes of those meetings, that's fine. If, however, the board is meeting separately from the membership, they just need to, keep their books, that's a separate meeting, right?
Okay.
It's a board meeting as opposed to a member meeting. And we're going to get into that a little bit more later on because we have to talk about meeting requirements for member meetings and the meeting requirements for board meetings. They could be the same. They may not be. So that's why you just need to make sure that you are clear in your bylaws that, for example, and we're going to get into this, the quorum might be different for a member meeting than it is for a board meeting, right? And we'll get into that.
Okay. So so just to clarify there, then basically the meet, because I think it was always seen often, right, that they were community meetings, right? And the board would be doing business at those, but they wanted to be open. And so the community was open. Now, like I said, different community centers may do this differently, but I think that was a lot of the original intent. And, over time, that's why it's good to have this conversation and for everybody to be able to be informed and think about these different options that they're doing.
Exactly. So you're not violating a statute if you're holding your meetings together. You set your rules in your bylaws. So I just want you to be clear with respect to what those rules are and do they apply to member meetings the same as they apply to board meetings, right? Because those are two different populations within the nonprofit. Okay.
This is Paul. I have kind of a follow-up question there. Could you go back to the slide again that you just moved from? Yeah. The issue with the Greater Ivy Citizens Community Center is that in the beginning, there was a lot of community participation. Over the past, I would say 8 to 10 years, that has dwindled. A lot of those founder people, have passed away. And so it's been tough for the executive director who preceded me to find new people and get new energy. And so the requirement of having the two meetings that the previous director tried to satisfy was accomplished, but it was accomplished more or less in formality only. I mean, and so I'm just wondering about, I know you're not offering legal advice here, but just perhaps a kind of point me in the right direction. With our situation, we have board members who I think share, a purpose. But this piece about engaging the broader community and particularly what does that entail, whether it's within our specific precinct, which is the way it's been written up, or whether it's countywide, there could be some kind of balance in there. But the idea of, and this is just simply for board membership, not association membership. So, and it seems like the second disadvantage seemed to be a very powerful one, that if a faction developed, there could be a lot of disruption as far as the association goes.
So first, you need to determine by looking at your bylaws and at your articles to see if you are a member-based organization. Okay.
Right.
If you are a member-based organization, which most likely you are, your bylaws should be clear about what the rights of the members are. And it could be they're just limited to the board, but you need to examine, what their rights are, right? What sort of decisions, what sort of fundamental decisions, and we're going to get into that, members have. And it could be, and there's no requirement that members, I'll have to look at this. So I'm going to have to take it back as to what particular fundamental decisions are governed by state law. Dissolution might be one of them. But if you wanted to, and I think this is where you're getting to, Paul, if you want to change your organization from a member-based organization to one that is simply run by the board, you would still, if you are now a member-based organization, in order to amend your articles and amend your bylaws, you're going to have to most likely, depending on what your bylaws say, have to get a supermajority of members to agree to that. Which, you know,
Okay.
if you only have a few members, it's not much of a problem, right?
Okay.
If you have a lot of members, it can be more of a problem.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Understand. Yep. Thank you.
All right.
I have a question about the membership. Our bylaws just define the location, you know, between this road and so forth. And then everybody is considered a member. So how does that affect like quorum and what you're talking about, a supermajority to vote on a change of bylaws and things like that? In other words, we have no list of names.
Right, right. So I can't answer your question because I don't know what your bylaws say, right? So that's why it's important to look at what your bylaws say, and maybe, you know, you want to talk to an attorney about your bylaws to see, you know, well, how do we gain representation from the community if everyone is defined as a member, right? So I would just star that in your bylaws is something that you should talk to an attorney about. Does that make sense? Okay.
Becky, one question here that I think it was James that had, and I think it was reading specifically from that one where I had given you a sample, and he said, why exclude youngsters under 18 years?
Mm-hmm.
And
that's the
and so,
18 is the age of majority. So otherwise, they can't really make a decision with respect to themselves or their family, right? So 18 is the age of majority in this state.
okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this slide talks, again, this is a sample that Terry provided me. It addresses the types of members the community center has. It also talks about the voting rights, right? So each member shall be entitled to one vote on each matter. Again, it's talking about after attending 2 meetings, the member will have voting rights at the 3rd meeting, right? So this, going back to your question, Ruth, if you were to put some sort of restriction on membership that talks about, you know, well, we'll consider you a member if you've attended 2 community meetings, right? And so that way you're defining, you're being a little bit more precise as to who your membership is. Okay? And again, in section 2 here, it says to maintain those voting rights, each member must attend 2 meetings annually. So you want to talk about, okay, you may be a member because you've attended 2 meetings. Okay, so you're a member this year, but the next year you don't attend any meetings. You're no longer a member. So you don't have a voice. You don't have a vote because you've not shown enough interest in this organization to maintain your membership. Right? I really like the way this is written because it sort of refines the scope of who is a member. And it makes it so it's only those people in the neighborhood who've shown interest, right? Who come to the meetings. Any questions?
I'll share one thing here of why this has come up in the past that may, I think in some in some instances, when it was a much broader, which was just basically anyone who lived or had interest in a community, which was the way I think a lot of them were originally written. From what I understand, sometimes just folks there would be a certain faction within a community that would show up and has just voted an entire board out without having even been showing up at the meetings. And so that had happened. So that was partly, I think, the impetus for creating this one in this way. So you couldn't just have people from the community who hadn't even been attended showing up, voting those out and putting in their own new board. So this allowed, and that's happened in the past sometimes. I don't think it typically happens these days, but it has in the past. So this was kind of a way to try to make it clear that you have to have at least been attending and participating, so that you didn't end up with that situation again.
Right. Babette, you raised your hand.
Yes, I want to talk about, we were talking about how many meetings you had to attend, and if you attended 2 in a year and the next year you didn't attend, how would that apply to people that in our community, we have some seniors that have health issues that may not have been able to attend a meeting, but would they still be considered members if they were? It's not that they didn't come because they didn't want to, it was because of sickness or mobility or not being able to get out. How would that be handled as far as them being a member?
Well, I'm not sure how Terry's organization would handle that, but one way that you can handle it is to write something in your bylaws that say that, basically, like, if you have a written excuse, right, that's accepted by the board, then that will not count against you. So you have so much flexibility in writing your bylaws. That's why I want to make very clear here. You can frame it however you want to frame it, so long as you're not violating the law. And there isn't anything in the law that addresses this particular issue of how you define membership.
Okay.
And I think that's a great point. This is not a recommendation that you all do this specific language. This was just an example, right, as a kind of a launching point. One of the challenges with this, what we have right here in front of us is, okay, how do you manage that then, right? As we're looking at it, how are you keeping up with it? So this is just kind of a conversation starter for you all to be thinking about these issues.
Exactly.
Becky, this is Jim. I have a question about the age again, the over 18 years or older. We have a lot of high school students using our gymnasium in the evenings and so on. And I know many of them are probably under 18, 16, 17, using the gym for basketball. And they would be a possible good source for members. And some of them may live outside our community, but is that 18 years of age across the board for all community centers that you know of, the bylaws?
I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I
mean, they're not going to, excuse me, but they're not going to be voting on for who's the governor or who's, they're not going to be voting in local elections, but it would seem like to try to get that group of the population that are interested in the community center, get them more involved if they're even interested. They may not be, but
so
go
one
ahead.
thing that you could do, you might not want to give them the authority to vote in the board, but you could give them a provisional membership that, gives them certain other benefits of being associated with the organization. So you can have more than one level of membership.
I see.
You can have your members who have the voting privileges and the decision-making authority over some of these more fundamental transactions that the organization might enter into. but then you give them, you know, a junior membership or something, and, you know, that
Good
gives
idea.
them,
Thank
and
you.
decide.
Thank you.
Okay. Not bad?
I was just gonna say that with the Shiloh Community Association, what we do is if you're under 18, you're always invited to a meeting. It's just, and we allow, you know, if you have some input or something, young people, because they have things that they might want to say, or they may want to tell someone, but they're always invited to come to the meetings. They just don't have the voting power that our membership would have because they're under 18, but they're always welcome to meetings. And that seems to satisfy that, as long as they know they're welcome to come and participate. And they may come back to you and say, have some ideas to tell you personally of what they reflect on, and you can take that back to the meeting, and that usually works.
Thank you.
Thank you, Babette. Okay, it's important also that you consider, like, who is a member, and, you know, in the case of the example, they're only a member so long as they attend 2 meetings a year. If you don't have that, or let's say there is there's a member, but they want to resign, or you as a board, you know, you're kind of like, I really don't want this person to be a member of our organization. So some bylaws will actually put in provisions with respect to member resignation and termination. But what I want to say is, if your bylaws are silent with respect to this is where the law comes in. This is a section, a Part 3, resignation and termination. This is right out of the North Carolina statute. And it talks about what happens if a member resigns. It also gives you what is permitted under the law with respect to you terminating a member, right? So for example, you can expel them if they haven't paid their dues, for example, if you have member dues. Whatever, there's also this guiding principle that whatever your termination provisions are, is that you can only do it if it's fair and reasonable and you're doing it in good faith. So if you want to put a termination provision in your bylaws, this is kind of a tricky one. So you want to talk to an attorney about what is fair and reasonable and in good faith. Okay. So we're running out of time. I've got a lot of slides to go through, but what I would want you to do is check your bylaws against these questions, right? And then if you have questions on how to answer them, then this is when you want to talk to a lawyer, okay?
Well, Becky, will the slides you're showing us, will they be available to us? The slides themselves? Okay.
I'll get these from Becky and then send it out to all you.
Thank you.
With the video too, so you could always go back or share it with somebody else in the community.
That's great.
And one thing that I'm going to do, Terry, is I have a lot of extra talking points that I'm having to skip over. I'll just put an audio feature into the slide, and you can hear everything I want to say about the slide without listening to the video too. So, okay. So this next standard provision in bylaws has to do with your meetings, right? So if you have members, you want to make sure that you have a meeting section as it applies to members. If you don't have members, you want to have a meeting section, but then it'll only apply to the board. Okay. So what we're going to focus on today is talking about meeting details for member meetings. And so you can see here that there's information about regular meetings, about special meetings. And I believe, yeah, it does talk about, that a 10-day notice must be given. So you want to just talk make sure that in your bylaws, you talk about regular meetings, when they're held, and then the special meeting can be called by the president or a third of the members of the board of directors, and then make sure that there is a notice that is given. That's very important. Okay.
Quick questions about special meetings. How do you deal with things that come up that have to be dealt with immediately that really need to be voted?
That.
Okay,
yes,
sorry.
We're going to get into that. Okay. So this notice requirement is very important. The law does require that you give people notice of a meeting, but it's not very specific. You can decide the number of days notice as long as it's fair and reasonable, right? So typical bylaws provide for X number of days written notice. If meetings are held regularly on the second Monday in the month, that constitutes adequate notice. So if you already have a specific day identified in your bylaws that it's always the second Monday of the month, that's considered notice under the law. If you want to send notice by an electronic means, this is where you may need to update your bylaws because email didn't exist in the 1970s, right? So you may want to include an extra provision regarding that, and we'll get into that. This slide here talks about what you should include in a notice of the meeting. So the company name, type of meeting, whether it's regular or special, who's to attend, date of the meeting, date of the notice, time of the meeting, purpose of the meeting, location of the meeting, the option of telephone or video conference if you've got this provision in your bylaws, and who is sending the notice. Okay, so this is a provision that talks about how, if you want to hold your meeting via Zoom, for example, or if you want to hold your meeting through a conference call. If you don't have this provision in your bylaws, you're opening yourself up to questions. North Carolina just recently passed a law that because of the pandemic, it is allowing meetings to take place via electronic means, but it's better if the pandemic's not going to be with us always, right? So it's better if you include a provision like this in your bylaws that allows for meetings to be held otherwise than in person. Okay, so this is an important one that you want to include to update. Okay. Now, actions without a meeting. I think, Ruth, you were the one who was asking, like, what do you do if you got to do something in a hurry and you don't have time to get a notice out, you don't have time to have people vote on it, you just need to do it. So actions without a meeting typically requires unanimous board consent. Email votes are generally not adequate unless there is unanimous board consent to voting by email. Now, this is a sample that was provided in the bylaws that Terry provided me. So action without a meeting in the case of a situation where the board has to make a decision outside of a regularly scheduled board meeting, the board will be advised in writing of the situation as much in advance as possible according to the essence of the issue to be voted on. A 2/3 majority vote of the members of the board is required to authorize what is requested. The board will not conduct what would be known as regular business in this manner. And then I really liked that they gave an example. An example of the need for a hasty decision would be our heat failing and hiring it repaired. Okay, so the important thing is that you have a provision in your bylaws that allows for these emergency actions, so actions without meetings. Questions? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about quorums. And this is where I was talking about if you're member based, you're going to have a quorum requirement for member meetings. And you'll also have a quorum requirement for your board of directors. And the definition of a quorum for each type of meeting may be different. So, an example of a quorum for the board, typically, if the majority of the board is present, that will constitute a quorum. You need to state your quorum requirements in your bylaws. Right? This is very typical provision. You probably all have this. Now, this is an example of a quorum for a member meeting, and it will be different depending on how many members you have. What is shown here is if you have, say, like 200 members on your books, right? How do you know if you have a quorum present? It's unlikely that you're going to get a majority of 200 members to attend a meeting where you want to, say, amend your bylaws, right? So you might want to reduce the number for your, if you have a large membership base, you might want to reduce the number of what constitutes a quorum for that membership base. Does that make sense? So if you have 200 members, if you had to have a majority to have a member meeting, have a quorum for a member meeting, you'd have to have 101 people there. Realistically, is that going to happen? Probably not. So if you have a large membership base, you might want to reduce the percentage of people that constitute a quorum. Do you see? See the issue?
So a question around that, because yeah, I see a really big issue for that with, right? That's one of the challenges with the whole member meeting aspect. And so if you're allowing members to, I think the idea was, right, to allow members to participate, since these are community organizations. I think that was probably the intent when all these bylaws were originally created, was thinking about that participation and encouraging that participation. So, but are you saying, like, if you are having, a meeting where you are including the members and allowing them to vote, there's always going to have to be some kind of provision around quorum there? So it's not, okay. So it's not to where.
In order for,
Go ahead.
In order for members to hold a meeting, there has to be a quorum. So the question is, what is the quorum for your registered membership, right? If it's a majority and you have 200 members, are you going to have 101 members there in order to hold the meeting?
And so let me give you this example, because this is what I think is kind of, I don't know if anything's typical anymore, but this is probably kind of what was typical at one time, is there would be the community meeting, right? And you have your elected officers and that are there able to make decisions and all that. And then whichever community members showed up at those, right, they were able to obviously have a voice. And then there were things to vote on, they would be able to vote, especially when it comes to voting on the officers. But I don't know that typically that many of the community centers were holding separate member meetings, right? It was just that they included the other.
Here's something that you could do. You could make sure that your bylaws say that, a quorum will be based on the number of people, or voting by members shall be based on a majority of the people who show up. I mean, you just have to be realistic about what your member meetings look like, who's going to show up, and what is fair to the membership.
Okay, thank you.
And state it in your bylaws.
So Becky, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it can be if you're at a regular member meeting and nobody shows up, but there is a quorum of the board members, then there's really no problem. And you could write the bylaws as a quorum of one of the members, correct? Or none of the members showing up. I think I may be dragging this out a little too much, but there should always be a quorum of the board.
Right. But if you are a member-based organization and an amendment to your bylaws is required, and that amendment is a right that is given to your members, and you have no members show up except for the board themselves. I mean, you can look at it that way. The board members are also members of your organization. So
thank you.
Okay. So this is just a little flashing light. Remember to include separate provisions for meeting requirements for your directors and then for your members, because 2 types of meetings, right? Okay. Again, check your bylaws. Okay, so the next standard provision has to do with your board of directors. This section should describe what the board's role is in the organization, how many people will be on the board, how long a board member's term will run, how often the board will meet, how board members will be appointed or selected. So in a member-based organization, board of director members are supposed to be elected by the members, right? If you are not a member-based organization, then the board of directors the positions are typically filled by the actions of the board. Okay? So in this sample, it talks about the roles of the board. It also gives the number and qualifications of the directors. And I like that they have a range. So no fewer than 5, no more than 15, with a goal of at least 9. Now, most smaller nonprofits struggle filling a large board. So having this range, rather than just saying there's going to be 7 members of the board, and then you operate with only 3, you want to have this range so that you know that as long as you fall somewhere between 5 and 15, you're good. You're not in violation of your bylaws, right? Another qualification is that no 2 directors shall reside in the same household or be from the same family. So, again, they're putting qualifications on who serves on the board. Now, this is interesting. In this particular sample, it says that the directors will be nominated by the current board, a nominating committee of the board, or the members, right? Nomination can come from the floor. So it's allowing for basically any role in the organization to nominate other board members. But it does, again, allow for the election by the members at I'm assuming this is the annual meeting in December. Okay. Now, this is something that I want you to consider to bring new life into your organization. So term limits, consider term limits for your board members. A term is the length of board service. Typically, they're spelled out in the organization's bylaws. Board Source, which is sort of a general resource for nonprofits, recommends 2 consecutive 3-year terms for board members. And also a recommendation these days is to have a staggered term system. So, you know, not everyone is rolling off at the same time, right? A staggered term system will allow for new members to be chosen each year, and it limits the number of terms expiring at the same time. And the beauty of a staggered term system is it allows for that history, that historical connection between old board members and new board members. So the old board members can provide a year of mentorship to the new board members before the old board members roll off. That makes sense? So why do you want to include term limits? You're managing the pace of constant change. You're guiding the organization towards sustainable long-term growth. You're developing new board talent, right? And it provides a mechanism for bringing in new members with fresh ideas, okay? So if you don't already have a provision in your bylaws with respect to term limits and staggered terms, I highly recommend that you do that. The drawbacks of term limits is potentially losing institutional memory, but if you include these staggered terms, there's the ability to maintain that continuity. And I wouldn't be surprised if everyone on this call has served longer than 2 3-year terms. That's very common. It's difficult to find replacements. I understand that, but you do want to try to introduce new people, and I'm going to show you how you might do that. Here's an example of staggered terms. Let's see how I'm doing on time. So again, this is where you want to check your bylaws. More questions here. So the next standard provision is officers. They don't have to all be president, vice president, secretary, treasurer. You don't have to call them that, but you do need to have official offices of the nonprofit, and you do need to state how long their terms should run. So the officer shows the pecking order in the organization, who reports to whom in terms of the overall governing structure. So the officers that are set in your bylaws, you know, the president, vice president, or president-elect, whatever you want to call them, secretary, treasurer, those are officers of the board. You can also, in your bylaws, make reference to the chief executive officer or executive director, who is the head of the staff of the organization. You can put a provision in your bylaws that relate to that chief staff position, but only insofar as it says that the executive director will report to the board of directors. You don't want to say too much about that in your bylaws, just an acknowledgement that that definition of roles exists so that the executive director and all members of the organization understand that the executive director reports to the board. The buck stops at the board, right? So you can put a provision in your bylaws that talks about that relationship. You don't have to, though, okay? Also in your bylaws, you need to make sure that you have procedures regarding filling and vacating any offices. It's very common for board members to say that they can't complete their duties in the middle of a term, and then you may have to replace that. So you do want to put some provisions in your bylaws with respect to that. So this is an example of officer roles, their election process, what happens when they resign, how do you fill vacancies. So all of this is pretty good stuff. If you don't have something like this in your bylaws, I highly recommend that you include it. Also, here are some examples of officer descriptions. It's important that you describe what the duties of each of the officers is. Like I said, you don't have to say president, vice president, secretary, treasurer. You can give them whatever name you want to give them. But I do want to talk about a couple of other roles that you might consider. You might consider a webmaster, because someone who knows how to update a website, if you have one, is important. You might consider adding that position. You also might want to consider adding a parliamentarian. So a parliamentarian is the expert in the rules of order. They're the ones who need to know what your bylaws say. They're the ones that should be referred to if there's any question about, do we have a quorum? So the parliamentarian is the one who will look at the bylaws and give you the answer to that. And the parliamentarian will also be very familiar with the parliamentary authority that governs how meetings should run in an organization. And the typical one, the one that most people use, is Robert's Rules of Order. So you need to make sure that the parliamentarian has a copy of Robert's Rules of Order so that they can answer any questions on how this meeting is being run. Okay, so quickly, we're going to talk about a few other standard provisions. So we're going to talk a little bit about committees. We're going to talk a little bit about decision-making. We're going to talk about amendments. We're going to talk about the indemnification provision and what that is, as well as the fiscal year. So some bylaws will provide for a list of standing committees, like there'll be a budget committee, there may be a landscaping committee, there may be a recruitment committee, there may be a nominating committee. It's my recommendation that you limit the number of standing committees to the bare minimum. Okay, because people have trouble filling out those committees. You can always start a committee. It's just not required under your bylaws, right? So you want to make sure that each committee has a significant amount of work to do. And if you have standing committees, disband them if they're not doing anything. You should consider including a phrase in the bylaws that says the board may establish and disband committees as needed to support its work, right? Alternatively, you establish a zero-based committee structure, which means that we're only going to have committees when we say that we're going to have committees, and they're only going to be active for such time as they're required to be active by the board, and the board has the authority to determine the beginning and the end of those committees. Okay. Now, this is what I suggest that you do if you're having trouble recruiting people to your board. Go ahead, start up a committee, a special project committee. It's a good thing, and invite non-board members onto these committees. Invite people from your membership onto these committees. What it does, it provides training for these people. They become more familiar with the board. And if they don't have time to serve on a board, or they're concerned about their liability serving on a board, but they want to help some way, having them on your committee helps that. Okay, so any questions about committees? Let's see. Now, the indemnification clause. The indemnification clause, indemnification is a legal term. And basically what it says is that to the extent it's permitted by law, if for some reason a board member is sued for his or her association with the board, with the nonprofit, for something that the nonprofit has done. And if that board member incurs costs defending that lawsuit or what have you, this is in addition to D&O insurance, by the way. But if for some reason that board member incurs some sort of cost, the indemnification clause obligates the nonprofit itself to reimburse that board member, to make that board member whole. Okay, so it's always a good practice to have an indemnification clause in your bylaws so that board members understand that they're not going to be hung out to dry if for some reason they are personally sued and it turns out that they really had been acting in good faith and there's no reason for them to be personally liable. Okay, does everyone understand the purpose of the indemnification clause? All right. Now we're going to talk about amendments. Amendments to the bylaws generally require a supermajority. So you have 100 people, 51 people is a majority, but a supermajority is typically 2/3 or 60%. It can be as high as 75%. It can be as high as 90%. You set what your supermajority is going to be. Okay, so amendments to bylaws generally require a supermajority, but there are other instances that should be considered. And this is examples, 3 examples of where a supermajority might be required, including the second one, the dissolution of the organization. You're probably going to want to have a supermajority. You don't have to, but these are major decisions regarding the life and existence of your organization. So in that case, you might want a supermajority, whether it's a member meeting, or members that decide that, or the board decides that. Okay? Questions? All right, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about there are different decision-making procedures. Everyone's familiar with majority rule. Now you've heard about supermajorities. That is your standard Robert's Rules of Orders type of decision-making. There are 2 other types of decision-making procedures, and if you choose to adopt them, there are special provisions that relate to them. I don't have time to talk about or show you examples of those different provisions, but I do just want to make you aware of these 2 other processes. There's consensus and then there's consent. Consensus and consent are both more democratically oriented voting decision-making processes. So with majority and even supermajority rule, there's no real discussion or attempt to understand another point of view. With majority, supermajority rule, it's like everybody votes. If the majority wins, that's the decision. With consensus, there is discussion, and then there is a decision to reach a compromise, an agreement, right? That's what consensus rule is. Consent is you may not reach a compromise, but you are unwilling to block something, that you do not have a significant reason to block something. So what consent is also the ability of every voice to be heard, every opinion to be understood. Whatever risk or concern is out there, everyone hears it, right? So it may ultimately result in a stalemate. So it may block the decision, which means it goes back for further discussion at a later meeting. So sometimes with both consent and consensus, if that is written into your bylaws, there may be a sort of a fail-safe, like we'll go through the consensus procedure or we'll go through the consent procedure, but if we can't come to a decision after going through 3 rounds, for example, then it'll go to majority rule. So there are all sorts of ways that you can vote. And like I said, the first one is the one that's most common. The latter 2 are to provide more of a democratic process to your decision making. Questions? And that can be a whole nother topic of discussion if you're interested. Okay, check your bylaws. Now, this very quickly has to do with IRS requirements. The IRS, with your 501c3 application and keeping it in good stead with the IRS, they don't have a requirement that you have any particular provision in your bylaws. They do require in your articles that you have what happens if you were to dissolve, right? And in that case, there's the provision that your assets need to be transferred to another 501c3. But even though there's no particular provision that the IRS requires to be in your bylaws, it does have prohibitions against what's called private inurement and private benefit. So private inurement and private benefit are the 2 prohibitions of the IRS. And those prohibitions require that you take a good look to make sure that you are not providing excessive compensation to your executive director, that you're not providing excessive compensation to your board. Most boards are volunteer boards, but very large nonprofits may pay their board members. So you have to make sure that nothing is in excess of what the standard is. With conflict of interest provision, you want to make sure that a person is not being benefited by any particular decision made by the organization or the board. So here's a simple conflict of interest clause. You want to make sure that this clause is in your bylaws. So whenever a director or officer has a financial or personal interest, that person shall fully disclose the nature of the interest and withdraw from discussion, lobbying, and voting. Okay, so you want to make sure that there's no appearance of a conflict of interest. Okay. Here's another example. I think this is the one from the bylaws that Terry shared. This is the dissolution clause that I was referring to. This has to be in your articles if you're seeking 501c3 status. It's a good idea that it's in the bylaws too. So upon dissolution of the corporation, assets shall be distributed for one or more exempt purposes. Any assets not so disposed shall be disposed by a court of competent jurisdiction. Disposals shall be made exclusively for exempt or public purposes. Any questions about the conflict of interest provision or the dissolution clause? So check your bylaws, do you have the conflict of interest provision, and does your dissolution clause match the clause that's in your articles? I can't tell you the number of times where I've seen one clause in the articles and another clause in the bylaws. Just make sure they're the same. Now, I want to talk just an instant about bylaws versus policies and procedures. You want your bylaws to be more general, as simple as possible, so that they will stand the test of time. Because remember, bylaws have the force of law. Policies, which typically govern day-to-day operations, do not have the force of law. But it's important that you have certain policies in place, like a conflict of interest policy, that make sure that you don't violate the private inurement or private benefit clause that the IRS imposes on you. So this is a list of suggested policies that you consider. The gift acceptance policy is very important. I also mentioned executive compensation, but there are also other policies that larger nonprofits, it really makes sense to have them, but smaller nonprofits, maybe not so much. I am in the process of compiling several examples of this, and I will share that with Terry as soon as I have them so that you can understand what they are. But basically, all of these policies are to make sure that you don't run afoul of any federal or state law that might jeopardize your tax exempt status. Okay. This is a nice little graphic that I found that you can look up and see what they're suggesting with respect to your bylaws. And then, let's see, I have 2 minutes. So then, this is a curriculum that is available through Extension. So Russ and Steve, if you are still on the call, you can access this curriculum, which is just fabulous and talks about how boards can sort of re-energize and reignite service of their organization. It's a really good curriculum. So I suggest that you take a look at it and maybe consider it for future programming, Terry.
And that's something, if we go to that link, anybody can access, Becky?
No.
Okay.
So this link is only available to Extension, and then Extension can share it with other people.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. I'll check with Stephen about that.
Okay. And then I have several helpful resources here, and there you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know this was a whole lot of information. So my question, Becky, because I know you had hoped to actually do a class exercise around refreshing your bylaws. And so what I wanted to ask you, because I think there's so much for everybody to kind of think about anyway, and we'll send out the slides, which you have. So that will help people. They'll be able to go back through and look at those specific slides and read over it. Because I know we were having to go through it so quickly, you probably didn't have a chance to read everything. Would you be willing to come back with us and let's do the workshop part, the class exercise part later? And that gives everybody a chance to kind of look over it. And the other folks that couldn't be with us, it'll have given them a chance to watch this, look over your slides. And then I bet folks are going to really have some questions, right? Because then they'll have time to process, looked at their own bylaws, and then us come back together. Would you be willing to do that with us?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so long as people go through their bylaws, they answer the questions, you know, if they're looking for other provisions, and then I can sort of help guide that process. But, you know, yeah, that'd be
I'm
fine.
guessing, does that sound like that would be really helpful to you all? Yeah, Nancy already said excellent. Yeah, Lorraine, that's what I'm guessing, because I know everybody's gonna, yeah, that will give them time to go look at it. Then we'll come back together. And I think that will be really valuable for folks, because then those specific questions will come up. Thank you for all this information, for your time in putting this together, for being with us, and for being willing to come back, because this is extremely valuable for everyone. And do you have any final comments there, Becky?
Well, I think it's great that you guys are willing to kind of go through a very dry and tedious exercise. But it is important that you do this, and you know, that you fully understand the purpose of your bylaws and how they can be your guideposts to becoming better boards and more effective in your community.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I think my hunch is that everybody after watching this will realize that probably almost all of our bylaws could use a little updating, because, well, things have changed, just like you said with those other meetings. The fact is probably most of those bylaws do not have that specific language in there about being able to have meetings via other forms than being in person. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for being with us today. Thanks for continuing this good work for your communities and being able to dig in and look at the exciting world of bylaws.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. See you all later. And I'll be sending out information from Becky that you can utilize to look at all this more closely.